Good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Livewire today. Before we get started, I'll give a short introduction about who I am. So my name is Philo. This is me according to Midjourney in the early 90s. I used Midjourney for all my slides. I maybe spent a little bit too much time on it, but it was a lot of fun. So I started with PHP in the late 90s, and I have been using PHP ever since. I freelanced for companies all around the world. I sold products online, and eventually I moved to Amsterdam, where I currently live with my dog Cooper. And when I moved to Amsterdam, I co-founded a startup, which was amazing. It was a roller coaster where we raised capital. We grew our team from just the 3 of us to 40 to eventually 80 people. But after that, I thought it was time for something new. I have a lot of passion for building products. And I thought hey, I want to see if I can make a living selling software online. So I think people reach out to me on Twitter and say this is the dream, being able to work wherever, whenever, building whatever product that you want. So I started to build software that I want to sell to people. And I noticed that building is the easy part, but getting it out there to customers is actually quite difficult. So this is one of the side projects that turned out into a new startup, which is called Anystack, which is a Laravel-based SaaS application, which aims to help developers out there to make a living selling software online. So if you ever thought about starting a side project, be sure to check it out. You can sign up. It doesn't cost anything, and you can basically connect your GitHub repository and sell your code to customers. The benefit of having your own platform is that I also use this to sell my own products. Maybe you've seen some of these. One of these is Wire Elements, which is like a Livewire component library, which all the main things that you might need when you start a SaaS application, like a modal slide over, a command palette, which you'll see in a second. And another one that I've built is Observer, which is a desktop application for Laravel Horizon, with the benefit being that you can basically add all your Laravel Horizon instances into a single desktop application. So you can switch between all these different instances instead of having to open your browser and switch to these different instances. But enough about that, let's get on with the talk. So back to the future. There's one thing that I want to talk about in a recent tweet that I've noticed, and that's about some of the recent developments in the tech community. This is a simplified piece of code back from 2007 from the WordPress code base. And yeah, that's how we did things back then. We got a piece of PHP and some HTML, we combined it, and we got a working application. Now, maybe you've seen this tweet recently where the Vercel community and the JavaScript community has gone crazy about holy shit, we can now use front end and back end together, which we have been doing with PHP for 15 to 20 years, which I thought was an interesting development. And there are more of these. If you know Basecamp, they decided to switch from AWS back to bare metal servers, and they expect to save $7 million in the coming years. There's another one. Amazon recently published a case study where they switched from a microservice architecture and from a serverless architecture back to a virtual machine environment and to a monolith application, saving 90% of their costs and making the whole application much easier to use. So my conclusion is that, well, there's a Dutch famous saying, vroeger was alles beter. In the past, everything was better. And in some cases, this might be the case. And should we go back to what we did back in 2007 with WordPress? No. But the cool thing is that with these new technologies that we get, we have new opportunities to use what worked in the past and combine it with something in the future or in the present. And one of these technologies that I find very interesting is Livewire. And this is another one that I saw. Freek from Spatie, they have this tool called Odeer, which is a application monitoring application where you can check if your website is online. And they switched from Vue back to Livewire. They said hey, we like writing backend code. We don't need the front-end complexity, so we'll use Livewire. So what is Livewire? Well, Livewire was introduced back in 2019 by Caleb Portio. It's inspired by Phoenix Live View. And yeah, it's a backend-focused package. It requires no JavaScript. In that sense, it requires JavaScript to function, but you don't have to write any JavaScript if you don't want to. It's very simple to use, and the primary benefit is that you can use the entire Laravel framework, including Blade, without having to sacrifice on your front-ending tools. So if you want to use a Laravel string helper, you can use it. There's no limit, and if you use Vue or React, then you are separate from the Laravel framework. Of course, there's inertia, which helps take care of some of these things, but you cannot use Vue or to, for example, call a string helper or to call an eloquent model directly. So there are a lot of benefits that Livewire brings to the table. Of course, there's also a few cons, but I thought it would be cool to point out, like, hey, how can you use Livewire to build a simple application? And let's dive into a little demo, which is a counter, which is like the Hello World example of Livewire. So I've got a counter example right here. So you can see we have a 0, we have a plus and a minus symbol. And if you look at our code, this is how a Livewire component looks like. It looks a lot like a regular Laravel Blade component, if you worked with this before. So you basically have a render method that returns the view. In this case, we have a counter Blade file. Now, if you look at this, you can see that we have a 0, which is the current count, and we have a plus and a minus sign. So normally, when you have a front stack like React or Vue, you might have to call an API endpoint to do something on the server side and increase the count. And with Livewire, this is a piece of magic that happened behind the scene. So what we can do is, if we switch to our components, we can define a public property called count and set it by 0 to default. Public properties are accessible in your Blade file, just like a regular Blade component. So if we change this, it should still be 0. And now we have our plus and a minus sign buttons that we want to wire up. And Livewire provides a syntax that it recognizes, and basically you can tell it to execute methods in our Livewire component. So we can use wire click and say we want to increment, and we can say wire click and decrement. So if we would try this right now, this doesn't work because it's going to complain like, hey, this method does not exist on your component. So if we switch back to our component, we can start implementing these methods. So we have our increment method, which increases the count. Next, we have our decrement method. This is, by the way, GitHub Copilot helping me along the way to speed things up. So now you can see that the counter works. You can hit the plus, we get the minus, and we did not set up an API, we didn't set up a controller. Everything happens within this Livewire component. So let's see how this works. So Livewire does a lot of things for you in the background. It's a bit of magic that you don't have to worry about, and that's the benefit in case you don't want to write any JavaScript. Livewire takes care of this. So what it does, it knows the state of your components. So once we click the plus sign to increase the count, this is the request that went to the server. It said like, hey, the data, the count object is currently 0, and I want to call the increment method on our component. And that's what happened. So behind the scenes, Livewire checks, okay, this is the component, and this is the method that we want to call. And this is the response that we get back from the server. So you can see it sends the entire HTML object back, and it also sends back the new state. So it keeps that in sync. So you can also see right here that the sign or the number has been increased to 1. So the state is being kept on the client side. So that's something to take into account. And if we would click the plus button again, the number 1 will be sent to the server, like, hey, the current count is 1, add a 1, so it becomes 2, etc. So it keeps on going like this. This is a simplified example. There's a course by Caleb Portio on Laracast about how he basically tells you or shows you how to build a simple version of Livewire, which is very interesting if you want to know more about how this works behind the scenes. So everyone knows the Laravel merch store. It's a famous store in the US where you can get your caps, your hats, your Lamborghinis, and they asked us to make a online store for them so they can make it easier to sell all their nice stuff across borders to different countries. So I've set up a example store, which is this. So we have our products, and we're going to take a look at a little example on how we can wire this up using Livewire. So I have my store front. So this is a simple blade file where, and I'll show you the components. So it doesn't do that much. It basically returns a view. We just provide it with all the products that are available. And in our view file, or in our blade file, we loop through all these different products and show the associated information. Now, what you might have seen is that here in the top right, we have a search field to search for different products. And right now, we type something, nothing happens. And it's kind of ridiculous how easy it is to add this functionality with Livewire. So if we go back to our blade file, the only thing we have to do is we can use another binding syntax. In the previous example, we used wire click, and now we have wire model. So we can say we want to bind this input field to a property of our Livewire component. So if I'm going to name this keywords, and I'm going to switch back to my component, and I'm going to define a public string or a variable called keywords. And this is all that it took to wire these two up. So anything that I'm going to type in this input field is now available inside the component on the backend side. So to solve to add the actual filtering, we can adjust the query to check when we have a keyword. We can check the use a SQL to make a where-like query to check for these keywords. So if we switch back and we now say Lambo, everything is filtered down, tall, and that's how easy. Like it literally took like a minute, 2 minutes to set this up. We did not have to define any endpoints, had to take into account front-end state or take care of something on managing the state between the front and back end. So let's move on. Next, we go to our product, and we want to be able to add this to our cart. So if I go back to our store product, you can see it's nothing special either. We just have the current product, and we render a blade view as well. So if we head to store products, we can see that we have a button here. So we'll probably do the same. Let's say wire click and say add to cart. Now we go back to the backend, and we'll have to implement this method. There we go. I already prepared this action, which takes care of the logic of adding the current product to the cart. And there's something new here. You can see that we're emitting an event called cart updated. And I'll show you in a second why this is so useful. But first, if we go back to our browser and click add to cart, you can see nothing happened. But if you refresh the page, you can see in the top right corner, the count in our cart turned to 1. But that's fine, but in this case, it's not that convenient because we want that number to be updated automatically, and we might want to show a notification that the product was added to the cart. So what I said about this event, we can use this event to talk to different Livewire components, but we can even hook into it with JavaScript itself. So again, if you use Livewire, you don't have to use any JavaScript at all. But in some cases, it can definitely be useful to use JavaScript. So I made this notification component, which is just a static blade component that says hey, your cart has been updated. I already put the code necessary here in place. So this is Alpine.js. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a lightweight JavaScript framework that is from the same creator. So Caleb created Laravel or Livewire, but also Alpine.js, and it's very simple. You can see I have a data property set, which has a show property, which is set to false, and I use an init callback where I just say, hey, if Livewire sends this event called cart updated, I want to set the show value to true, and I add a little timeout to set it back to false after 2 seconds. So Livewire allows you to connect both with your front-end utilities and frameworks or whatever you use, but also with the backend, which we'll go into a little second. So if we refresh the page and click add, you can see that we now get this notification and it goes away after 2 seconds. So this is very convenient, so you can just emit events from your backend and pick them up on the front end as well. Next, we added this to our cart, and you can see that the number is still 1. So how can we make sure that this value is updated? Well, to do this, we can use the same event. So if you go to our store header, you can see right now that the only thing that it does is it gets the current count from the cart. We emitted an event called cart updated, and Livewire has a public property or variable that you can define to listen to events. So it's public listeners, it accepts an array, and you can tell it to either call a method. So you could do like foobar and so now whenever this event occurs, this method will be called on the component. Now in this case, we only want the component to refresh itself because we want the count number to be reflected. So Livewire has this reserved keyword that you can also provide it a refresh string, which tells it, hey, I want this component to be refreshed. So if we now go back, we add a new product to our bag, you can see that the number on the top right corner will be updated. And yeah, there we go, it's now set to 2. So you can use events to talk between different Livewire components. Next up, we have our cart. So here we can see all the carts that we have in our product. And we want to be able to increase the quantity count and delete a product from our cart as well. So if we go to our stored cart, it's the same process. Here we have our buttons, so we can wire click, decrement. But in this case, we want to decrease the quantity of a specific item of our cart. And you can also provide arguments to these callbacks. So we want to call this method on our component, but we want to make sure that it is for this specific item. So we can just echo out this ID inside this callback. And then we can copy this and do the same here. And finally, we have our remove button, where we will do the same. So in this case, we want it to call one of these 3 methods. It will pass along the item ID, and we want to remove this from the cart. So let's use some Copilot magic again. So again, I already made these little actions which take care of increasing the quantity or decreasing it or removing it from the cart. You can see that we get the item ID which we passed earlier. And in this case, when we remove a product from the cart, we emit this event again so that the counter on the top side corner is updated, and we get the notification on the top right corner as well that we removed the product. So if we remove something, we'll get the message on the top right corner. You can see that the quantity count has been updated as well. If we hit plus or minus, we can increase the quantity and remove all our products from the cart. It was that simple. Like, this is one of the things that astonished me about Livewire. The productivity boost is insane. I've been using it ever since I discovered Livewire. I've been using this almost for all my projects. And once you get a hang of it and know how all these things work, you can write SPA-like applications so extremely fast. And that's why I'm really a big fan of Livewire in combination with Laravel and Alpine.js. It's definitely worth trying if you haven't already. Let's move on. So finally, I want to give you a few tips. In case you get started with Livewire, there are a few caveats that you have to take into account where you can run into and think like, hey, why isn't this working? By the way, this is the command palette that I talked about. This is a Livewire component that is a command palette which is context aware, so you can even like tap into like the store, or in this case, we want to talk about caveats. So the first one is forms and buttons. So we have a counter again, but in this case, if we click increment, you can see that nothing happened. If we click it again, it turns to 11. If we click decrease, it goes to 12. So what's going on here? If we go to this blade component or blade file, you will see that we echo out the count and we call increment and decrement like we did earlier. But one of the things that you might fall into is that buttons act like a submit button when they're inside a form. In this case, you can see that on the top side here, it's not a div, it's a form. So what it does an XHR request to the backend to increase the count, but at the same time, it's refreshing the page because it thinks like, hey, this is a form, so I have to submit it. So the only thing to fix this is to make sure that your buttons have a button type. This way, it will not trigger a submit action. If you're using forms with Livewire and you want to trigger a method on a submit, you can also do, I think it's wire submit. And you can say prevent the default submit, and then we can say call this method. So that also works if you are using a form and want to submit something. So if we head back, you can see now it shows the appropriate value and it no longer refreshes the page. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is no rules. This is a form that shows all the products in our store, and it has an input field where I want to be able to modify the product name. Right now you can see that all the fields are empty, but if you look at our code, let's see. You can see that we're looping through all the products. We're wiring up this model to say like, hey, we want this to be equal to the product name, but nothing shows up. If we type something, it will give you a hint on what's going on. So Livewire tries to protect you by default when you're using model and collections so that you don't expose any sensitive or public information to the front end. So in this case, it requires us to set up a rule. So if we look at this component, you can see that we're mounting or assigning all our products to a products variable. And this is what it requires in order to show. So now you can see that all the values are correct. If we type something, you can see that the corresponding value above the field is updated as well. And this is something Livewire does for you out of the box to keep you safe, to make sure that you're not giving out any public information in your input fields that you want to have protected. But it doesn't do that all the time because it depends on whether it's in a collection, for example. Because if we move on, I'll give it in a second. Public means public. First, diffing. Livewire smartly replaces the HTML on your page whenever it receives an update. It tries to do so smartly. So if only one element of your page is updated, it tries to just update that specific element on the page. But in order to do so, it must be able to track your DOM nodes. So if we take a look, so I got five import fields with the letters corresponding to the left and to the right. Now, if I delete a random value, in this case it works. In this case, it doesn't. So you can see that it shifted our input field. So C is now assigned to D, which should not happen. And this is when Livewire is unable to detect what has changed specifically on the page. So here you can see I'm looping through these items. And to solve this, we only have to make a unique ID. So Livewire knows like, hey, this is, in this case, this item, and this is the input field. So I can use wire key and say like, hey, this is item. I think that should do it. So now every list item is assigned a key that allows Livewire to track all these changes on your page and knows which list item to update. So right now, if I do the same, and if I remove a random value, you can see that everything stays in the same order. So even if we remove more, it stays the same. So that's something to take into account. If you get really weird HTML or like views on your application, then it might be that there are some diffing problems where you have not defined a unique key. So this often occurs very often when you're looping through different items. Next, public means public. So this is a case where Livewire does not protect you out of the box. I create an array, and this array contains my user information, and I assign it to a public data property on my component. I got an update method where it updates this user with all the given data, which is a bad example. You should not do this, and I'll show you in a second. There's a die and dump that basically shows my current information. There's a destructive method, and then there's the render method. So I can change my name and this gets updated. So if we refresh the page, it stays the same. And you can see my name has been updated. But now let's open Livewire DevTools. We can go to this component, see the data, and yeah, let's change this email to something else. So now the state has been modified on our client side, and I'm going to click update. And if you now say view details, you can see that the email also got updated in my database. So this is a bad example where you should know that anything you make public on your Livewire component is actually public and can be modified. There's also a way that Livewire has this global JavaScript option you can interact with. So I can do the same. If we go to our HTML, you can see that this Livewire component has this unique ID. If we go to our console, we can say Livewire find and pass this component ID, which will return the associated JavaScript object for this component. And we can say set data. For example, let's change our user ID to 5. And now, how did it work? Change something else. Oh wait, sorry. I've got every time you refresh the page, like the component ID changes as well. So there we go. You can see that the value got updated. If I click update, you can see that my name now has changed to John Doe. But you might have also seen that there's this method on our component called destructive. This is not a public exposed method name that you can see everywhere, but users can guess, right? So it could be delete or something else. So if we try to do the same, instead of set, we can just call this method. And there you go. We just called a destructive method that we might have guessed. So be aware that anything that you make public inside your Livewire component is public, and there are ways for users to trigger these, read the information. So be aware. Next up is rate limiting. Well, this applies to any type of application that you're building, whether it's an API or a Livewire application. I got this button and it sends an email. So every time I click it, I can just keep on spamming emails. So with a regular API endpoint, you might just use the built-in rate limiting features provided by Laravel. In this case, Dan Harris, which I think has also been here to give a talk, has created this cool package which allows you to add rate limiting features to Livewire. So this is the original method. You just increase the count on the email sent. And here is the example by when using this package. So you add a trait called with rate limiting. We again define the method send mail. And this gives us access to this method called this rate limit, where we can say like, okay, we want to allow 1 attempt, and by default it's set to 60 seconds. So we can only send 1 email every 60 seconds. If it exceeds that amount, it throws an exception, and in this case, we throw a validation message. So now, if you try it again, we've got our 1 email. If you try to click again, you can see that we now are like, hey, slow down. So this is something to take into account with Livewire. It may be less obvious to implement these rate limits. Often when you're building APIs, this is one of the common things to think about. And it could be an oversight since Livewire is so easy to use, and you just say, okay, fire this job, send this email. Be aware that users can click 10 times and trigger 10 emails. So adding some form of rate limiting is definitely useful. Finally, show and hide. So here I have a way to toggle message. If we look at our network page, you can see that every time I click the toggle, it starts to make a request to the backend to give us the updated blade. Now, this is an example where Livewire isn't the best use case. In Livewire version 3, some new things are coming up which will make this easier without having to do a server request. But if we look at show and hide, this is the current implementation. So we have a public property called show message. When it's set to true, we want to show the message. And we have a wire click handler that toggles the message. Now, a better way to do this is, in this case, to use Alpine. And it's similar like the notification I showed earlier. We add a data object to our div that sets show to false by default. We have a message that will show in case show is set to true. And we have a button that basically toggles this show variable. So right now, we get the same functionality, but without doing any request to the server. So it's definitely useful to use a little bit of JavaScript when creating like these little simple toggle components where you don't need a server request to get any additional information. In that case, just use JavaScript. That's that. Yeah, so finally, there's some exciting news, of course. If you kept track in the Livewire community on Twitter, you may have noticed that Caleb is working on version 3. He also showcased it, I think last year or earlier this year. But there are a ton of cool new features coming, like hot reloading. It's going to be powered by Alpine.js by default. We're going to get smooth animations out of the box. We can inject JavaScript from our backend into our frontend, which is kind of weird, but it allows you to do some really fancy stuff without doing like the extra additional requests to the server. We can lock public properties by default, which, like I showed you just earlier, so the modification of these public properties you can lock in the future. We get wire model that's going to be deferred by default. Right now it sends a request every time you type something in an input field. It goes and sends a request, and that's going to be changed to only do it when you debounce or unfocus a input property. We're going to get wire navigate, which really introduces like an SPA kind of page navigation, so you don't get any page reloads. It looked on what Caleb showed, it looks really promising and really fast. There are component requests are going to be batched. Right now, if you have 10 components on your page and you send out a component event and all these components listen to this event, 10 requests will be made because each component will trigger a request to the server to have the component updated. Now in Livewire 3, this is going to be awesome because it allows all the requests to be batched. So if you send out an event and you need 10 components to be updated, it's just going to be one request. We're going to get reactivity for nested components. So you can right now nest Livewire components, but the parent component won't get updated by itself because it's unaware of the state of its child components. So that's something that's going to be changed in V3. There's even a teleport way where you can teleport data from your Livewire component to a whole different section of your HTML. There's a persist directive, so when you're navigating between pages, you can persist certain components on the page so they don't get refreshed. And during the latest Laracon in India, they announced single file components called Laravel Vault, which is going to be a first-party package from Laravel. So you can basically go back to 2007, put everything in a single file. You have your PHP and your HTML, but in this case, you get some nice fancy features by Livewire. So we're going to go back to the past for some of the things that worked really well back then and combine it with the nice new things that we have these days. So thank you so much. If you want to follow me on Twitter to learn more about Livewire, or I share a lot of things that I'm building products or products that I'm building, feel free to join or follow me on Twitter or check out my blog. I haven't posted in a while, but there are some good articles on there if you want to get started with Livewire and do some more advanced stuff. I would love to cover way more about Livewire, but the problem was that I only have 30 minutes, so I wasn't able to cover everything. But there's a lot of ton of great features. I'm not sure when version 3 will launch. I'm hoping for Laracon US, which is in June or July, I think. And yeah, there's a lot of great new features coming out. You can check out Caleb Portio on Twitter as well. He's been tweeting about some of the new developments on Livewire. So yeah, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for having me, and enjoy the talk by Steve.
Yeah, well, actually, the Dutch Laravel Foundation, well, the banner is very big here, announced that they are going to give away 2 tickets for their meetup on the 22nd of June. And we decided to make it a little bit of a quiz kind of thingy, or quiz? You have to, the one with the best question, or the greatest question, according to Philo and according to Steve, the second ticket will be given away later.
We're doing a little bit of improv.
Will win this.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions, think of something great, and Philo will
and if there are no questions, I'm just going to randomly throw in.
There in the back.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Can you maybe read?
Are also useful in other web frameworks like Django, Flask, Express.
Can you repeat the questions?
Whether Livewire can be used in other front-end frameworks, right? Like
in other web frameworks.
Other web frameworks. No, it's Laravel specific. You can create, however, like fancy stuff. Like I once created like this embeddable JavaScript widget with Livewire. So you can create some stuff outside your Laravel application, but you have to do some JavaScript magic or iframe it. That could work. But yeah, it does require Laravel to work. Yes?
Since you make a lot of requests for the XML and such, does it work well on slow internet connections?
Yeah, so the question is whether it works well when the internet connection is slow. In that case, well, you get the same thing, right? When you make an API call to a backend, when you click a button, you would have to wait till the request is finished. And with Livewire, it's the same. You can, however, use certain handlers that you can put into your Blade file to, for example, show a loading state. If you click a submit button, you can add wire loading, and then you can just say, I want to show this div or this button or this text in the button saying like loading whenever a request is ongoing. But yeah, I think in that case, yeah, you have to wait till the request is done before the HTML is updated. And that's, of course, benefits of a front-end library or front-end framework where you're not reliant on the server. But when you're doing an API call, then you still have to wait. Well, I guess you could, on the front end, when you're using a front-end framework like Vue, you could update the front end while you're waiting for the request to finish. So that's definitely a benefit of using a front-end framework.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
What is the simplest use case that you won't use Livewire for?
What is the simplest use case where you won't use Livewire for? Well, the counter was a example which you probably wouldn't use Livewire for, or like the toggling of a message. So all these kind of basics things where you just do things with JavaScript instead of making an entire trip to the server. Yeah, then it might be a bit cumbersome to use Livewire. But again, if you don't have a really busy application, you could go like crazy and just do everything with Livewire because, yeah, it doesn't damage the performance that hard. But if you have a really busy application, then it does hurt your performance a little bit because it makes a round trip to the server every time. So if you have tens of thousands of users clicking a toggle message to show or hide a static message, then it's a bit of a waste of resource, of course. So in that case, I wouldn't recommend using Livewire, but just use Alpine or plain JavaScript or something. Yes?
Did you ever experience the boundaries of Livewire? So is there a project where it's better to choose Vue.js, for example?
Sorry, come again, if?
Is it, what is the, did you ever experience like that you don't want to use Livewire because it's too slow?
Whether I haven't had a moment where I didn't want to use Livewire because it was too slow. Till this day, I have not. It has worked very well for me. I know that from Spatie, like the Odeer app, I know they are serving quite some traffic and have quite some users as well. So yeah, you might have to put in an extra server if you get a lot of traffic, but the same thing would apply, I guess if your API gets hammered. So far, I haven't had any problems with Livewire in terms of performance. Yeah, it's also been a while since I used Vue, or well, I used React, which works great as well. But no, I don't see, I haven't had any problems ever since. I made a few React apps because I was forced to use React. But other than that, whenever I have the free choice to choose what stack that I want, then I would use Livewire at this point, but maybe things change, I don't know. Yes.
You showed how to emit events.
Yeah.
Can you emit events from other places from your application, so outside of Livewire, for instance, in a job, when a job is finished?
Yes, you can. Well, yes, and not the way I showed Casey just now. So you can't do this emit, but you can use Laravel Echo, for example, that's integrated with Livewire. So you could use the broadcasting functionality of Livewire, of Laravel, to have a component of Livewire respond. So the listener property that I defined on the component, where I right now set card updated, there you can put in like a channel event that's broadcasted by Laravel and have the component respond to that. So you could interact with Livewire on that way, but you have to use Laravel Echo in this case. Yes?
You briefly showed the rules mechanism.
Yeah.
Is it also compatible with the core Laravel rule mechanism? Can you use it to validate the input as well?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is whether the rules array that I showed on the components, whether that's a native Laravel validation, and it is. So in this case, I define a public property, but you could also define a public method called getRules and return an array, so you can add like the rule classes that Laravel ships with, but it uses the Laravel validation or validator behind the scenes. So you can use anything that you want. Yes?
Last two questions, maybe?
Sorry?
Last two?
Yeah?
I've been working on some rather large applications using Livewire already, and one of the things I noticed was that when you get a lot of components, it's quite hard to keep control of the case, to say so.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like a convention or a way of namespacing the Livewire components?
Yeah, so what I once did, but like whenever you start to split these components up into little pieces, it also adds a little overhead. But one of the things I tried once in one of my projects, it does work, but it's kind of a decision you have to make whether you find it convenient or not, is to split up the components in traits. So I would create a component called counter, for example, and inside this counter namespace, I would create a few traits with one that contains all the properties, another that contains all the methods. Because I think that's what you're referencing to, right? That you get like these really long Livewire components, or?
Yeah, and also like a lot, and I try to often stick to like RESTful naming,
Yeah.
a little bit with like index and creating and such, but they don't really overlap with the component-based idea of Livewire.
Yeah.
I've been searching for something to give it a little structure.
Yeah. Let me think about it. I'll see. So far, just giving it the name that the thing that it does seem to have worked for me, but I do recognize that sometimes it can get a bit like cluttered with all these different components, and especially once you start adding more complexity to these Livewire components, the file might get a little bit bloated. So using the traits was one of the things that I tried. And in terms of namespace and conventions, I'll think about it and I'll get back to you. I haven't answer on that like right now.
Last question.
Thanks.
So, I got your answer to me, but if you have something like a view counter
Yeah.
resource, it won't update until the user interacts with the website, or if you have a Laravel Echo event in the background, just refresh it constantly.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a few ways to talk to Livewire components. You can use events from the backend side. You can use the front-end Livewire JavaScript object that receives events, but you can also use it to send events. And Laravel Echo is another alternative to broadcast channel events, which Livewire integrates with them as well. So you can, I actually made like a upload feature where you can upload like 50 files and then have a dynamic progress bar to show you the progress of the upload state. And how this works behind the scenes is that it dispatches a job that is processing every file to being uploaded to S3. And every time a file had finished to upload to S3, I would emit a echo event saying like, hey, this file has finished. And that event would be broadcasted to the browser, which Livewire picked up, and then it can update the Livewire component to show the actual progress of the upload and the files being processed. So in that sense, there are enough ways to interact with a Laravel component from outside Livewire itself using broadcasting or the global JavaScript object.
Is that not what hot reloading was in the feature, upload features, where it would all be like one feature?
Sorry, come again?
The
Hot reload? Oh, that's during development. So from what I've seen during development, or from the video from Caleb, is that you can develop your components if you write some input in your input field, and you would change the code on your Livewire component. Like the state of the component would stay while the component refreshes. So now when you work on a component, if you change code, you have to refresh the page in some cases, and then the state of the input field will be lost. And that will stay. So if you enter your name in the input field, you make some changes to the backend code of your Livewire component, then your name will stay in the input field while the rest of the page gets reloaded.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. I think Philo will give out the ticket. Do you want to give it now, or do you want to think about it a little bit?
I'll think about it a little bit.
Okay, that's fine.
Keep the tension.
To keep the tension. Then we'll have a little break of 10 minutes if you want to drink something, and then we'll sit back and listen to the talk of Steve.